At 11:47 p.m. on October 13, 1997, security cameras at Harvard University's Widener Library captured Dr. Margaret Whitmore walking through the main entrance, her leather briefcase clutched tightly against her burgundy coat. The 42-year-old history professor nodded to night security guard Thomas Chen before disappearing into the stacks on the third floor. What happened in the next 6 hours and 13 minutes would become one of New England's most baffling mysteries and destroy everything the academic community believed about safety, trust, and the people they thought they knew. By morning, Dr. Whitmore had vanished completely from a building that was locked from the inside, monitored by motion sensors, and had only one way in or out. Her coffee cup still sat warm on her desk, her research notes spread exactly as she'd left them, and her car remained parked in the faculty lot with her keys still in her purse. The security system showed no record of anyone leaving the building after her entry, yet somehow, impossibly, Margaret Whitmore was gone. If you think you've heard impossible disappearance cases before, trust me, you haven't heard anything like what happened at Harvard that October night. Make sure you're subscribed because the evidence we're about to uncover gets more disturbing with each revelation. The town of Cambridge, Massachusetts, had always prided itself on being the intellectual heart of America, home to Harvard University since 1636, and a community where Nobel Prize winners lived next door to Supreme Court justices. In 1997, the tree-lined streets around Harvard Square bustled with the energy of 20,000 students and faculty members who believed that education and enlightenment could solve any problem. This was a place where violent crime felt as foreign as speaking a dead language, until the night Dr. Margaret Whitmore proved that evil could hide behind even the most prestigious facades. Margaret had grown up in nearby Lexington, the daughter of a mathematics professor at MIT and a classical pianist who had performed with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Her childhood had been filled with intellectual discussions around the dinner table and summer vacations spent exploring historical sites across New England. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Wellesley College, earned her Ph.D. in American history from Yale, and joined Harvard's faculty in 1989 at the remarkably young age of 34. Her specialty was colonial American witchcraft trials, a subject that had fascinated her since she'd discovered that one of her ancestors had been accused of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. Margaret's research had uncovered new evidence about the social and political motivations behind the witch trials, earning her recognition as one of the country's leading experts on this dark chapter of American history. Her book, The Devil's Advocates: Political Manipulation in Colonial New England, had won the Bancroft Prize in 1995 and established her as a rising star in academic circles. Students adored Professor Whitmore's passionate lectures, where she would pace across the front of the classroom in Sanders Theater, her voice rising and falling as she brought 300-year-old court records to life. She had a gift for making historical figures feel like real people rather than names in dusty textbooks, and her classes consistently had waiting lists of students hoping to add her courses. Colleagues respected her meticulous research methods and her willingness to challenge conventional historical interpretations with evidence-based arguments that often overturned decades of accepted wisdom. Margaret's personal life reflected the same intellectual intensity that drove her professional success. She lived alone in a restored Victorian house on Brattle Street, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and original colonial documents she'd collected over the years. She had never married, telling friends that she hadn't found anyone who could compete with the fascinating dead people she spent her days researching. Her closest relationship was with her research assistant, 28-year-old Jennifer Walsh, a doctoral candidate who had been working with Margaret for 3 years on a new project that would examine previously unexplored court records from the Salem Witch Trials. The evening of October 13th began normally enough. Margaret had taught her Monday afternoon seminar on women in colonial America to 15 graduate students, leading a discussion about the economic factors that determined which women were accused of witchcraft. Several students noted later that she seemed particularly excited about something, mentioning that she'd made a breakthrough discovery that would change everything historians thought they knew about Salem. When pressed for details, Margaret had smiled mysteriously and said they would have to wait for her upcoming presentation at the American Historical Society Association conference in January. After her seminar ended at 4:30 p.m., Margaret had dinner at Harvest Restaurant with her longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Ashton. a professor of colonial literature. Ashton later told investigators that Margaret had been unusually animated during their meal, talking about documents she'd discovered in the Massachusetts State Archives that contained explosive revelations about prominent Boston families whose ancestors had profited from the witch trials. She'd shown him photocopies of what appeared to be financial records and private correspondence, but the restaurant's dim lighting made it impossible for him to examine them closely. Margaret was convinced she'd found evidence of a conspiracy, Ashton told Detective Sarah Morrison during his interview on October 15th. She kept saying that powerful families had orchestrated the accusations to seize property from their victims. She was planning to expose everything in her next book, even though she knew it would make enemies of some very influential people. After dinner, Margaret had returned to her office in the Barker Center to prepare for her evening research session at Whitmore Library. The Barker Center, a beautiful Georgian revival building that housed Harvard's humanities departments, buzzed with the energy of professors holding office hours and graduate students working on dissertations. Margaret's office on the third floor overlooked the courtyard where students gathered between classes, and her door was always open to anyone seeking help with research or career advice. Jennifer Walsh stopped by around 8 p.m. to discuss their ongoing project and found Margaret packing her briefcase with unusual urgency. She had this stack of documents that I'd never seen before, Jennifer later recalled. When I asked about them, she said they were insurance and that she needed to cross-reference them with some materials in the Whitmore archives. She seemed nervous, which wasn't like Margaret at all. She was usually the calmest person I knew. Margaret left the Barker Center at 8:45 p.m., walking across Harvard Yard toward Whitmore Library as autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet. Several students and faculty members saw her making this familiar journey, a route she'd taken hundreds of times during her 8 years at Harvard. Professor Michael Davidson, who was leaving the library as Margaret approached, held the door for her and exchanged pleasantries about the upcoming midterm exams. He would be the last person to see Margaret Whitmore alive. Whitmore Library, Harvard's main research facility, contained over 3.3 million books and represented one of the world's largest academic libraries. The neoclassical building, completed in 1915 as a memorial to Harry Elkins Whitmore, who died on the Titanic, had been designed with security as a primary concern. After 6 p.m., access was restricted to faculty members and graduate students who possessed special key cards, and the building was monitored by a sophisticated security system that tracked every entry and exit. Thomas Chen, the night security guard who had worked at Whitmore for 12 years, remembered Margaret's arrival clearly because she'd complimented him on the Boston Red Sox cap he was wearing. Dr. Whitmore was always friendly, he later told investigators. She'd been coming in for evening research sessions at least twice a week for months, always professional, always polite. Nothing seemed unusual about that night, except maybe she seemed a little more focused than normal, like she had important work to do. The security system recorded Margaret's keycard access at exactly 11:47 p.m. as she entered through the main entrance and proceeded to the third floor, where the American History Collection was housed. Motion sensors tracked her movement to Corral 23, a private study area she had reserved for her research on the Salem Witch Trials. The library's climate control system maintained detailed logs showing that the third floor remained occupied until approximately 2:15 a.m., when the motion sensors stopped detecting movement in Margaret's area. What happened between 2:15 a.m. and 6 a.m., when the library's day staff arrived for work, would become the focus of an investigation that consumed the next 27 years. The morning shift supervisor, Linda Rodriguez, found Corral 23 exactly as Margaret had left it. Her coffee cup still contained lukewarm liquid. Her laptop computer was open to a document titled Salem Conspiracy Confidential, and her research materials were spread across the desk in what appeared to be the middle of active work. Her burgundy coat hung on the back of her chair. Her briefcase sat open beside the desk, and her car keys lay next to her coffee cup as if she'd planned to return momentarily. But Margaret Whitmore was nowhere to be found in a building that had remained locked and monitored throughout the night. Linda Rodriguez's first assumption was that Margaret had stepped away briefly and would return shortly, perhaps to use a restroom or retrieve additional materials from another floor. But as minutes turned to hours with no sign of the professor, concern grew into alarm and eventually into panic. By 9 a.m., Linda had contacted library administration, who authorized a systematic search of the entire building. The search revealed the impossibility of Margaret's disappearance in stark, undeniable detail. Every exit from Widener Library was monitored by the security system, which recorded all key card usage and door openings throughout the night. The logs showed Margaret entering at 11:47 p.m., but no record of her or anyone else leaving the building until Linda Rodriguez arrived for work at 6 a.m. Windows on the third floor were sealed shut and protected by security sensors that would have triggered alarms if opened. The building's ventilation system contained openings too small for human passage, and emergency exits were equipped with alarms that would have alerted campus security immediately if activated. Yet somehow, Dr. Margaret Whitmore had vanished from a locked building as completely as if she had never existed. Harvard University Police Chief Raymond Murphy had handled countless incidents during his 15 years in campus law enforcement, from student pranks and alcohol violations to the occasional theft of valuable books or research equipment. But standing in Corral 23 at 11:30 a.m. on October 14th, examining Margaret's abandoned research materials while trying to understand how a woman could disappear from a monitored building, he felt the familiar chill of encountering something beyond his experience and training. Murphy's initial assessment focused on the possibility of a medical emergency that might have caused Margaret to become disoriented and wander to an area where she hadn't yet been found. The Harvard University Police Department, assisted by Cambridge Police and Massachusetts State Police, conducted a room-by-room search of Widener Library that consumed the entire day and extended into the evening. Every study carrel, every bathroom, every storage area, and every maintenance space was examined by officers who understood that they were looking for either a living person who needed medical attention or a body that would explain Margaret's disappearance. The search produced nothing except growing bewilderment among investigators who couldn't explain how someone could vanish from a building that had remained under constant electronic surveillance. Margaret's research materials provided the first clues about what might have motivated her disappearance or abduction. Her laptop computer contained drafts of academic papers that accused several prominent New England families of orchestrating the Salem Witch Trials for financial gain, using false accusations to seize property from their victims. The document suggested that she had discovered evidence linking these families to modern-day institutions and fortunes built on property stolen during the witch trial hysteria of 1692 to 1693. More disturbing were handwritten notes that indicated Margaret believed someone was monitoring her research and possibly threatening her safety. One note, dated October 10th, 3 days before her disappearance, read, "They know what I've found. Phone calls with no one speaking. Car followed from archives. Must secure evidence before presentation." Another note, apparently written on October 13th, stated, "Meeting tonight. Too dangerous to keep materials at office. Widener's safest place until I can decide next steps." The "they" that Margaret referenced in her notes remained unidentified, but her research suggested she had uncovered information that could damage the reputations and possibly the financial interests of families whose social prominence in New England traced back to colonial times. Dr. Robert Ashton confirmed that Margaret had mentioned receiving strange phone calls and feeling like she was being watched, but he had encouraged her to report these concerns to police rather than trying to handle the situation alone. Detective Sarah Morrison of the Massachusetts State Police took over the investigation on October 16th, bringing experience from major crime investigations and missing person cases that had prepared her for complex scenarios, but not for the physical impossibility of Margaret's disappearance. Morrison's background included solving murders where the only evidence was microscopic DNA traces and tracking down suspects who had changed identities and disappeared into new lives across the country. But she had never encountered a case where the primary challenge was understanding how someone could leave a monitored building without triggering any security systems. Morrison's interview with Jennifer Walsh revealed additional details about Margaret's final weeks that painted a picture of a woman under increasing psychological pressure. Jennifer described her mentor as normally calm and methodical, someone who approached academic challenges with scholarly detachment and professional confidence. But during October, Margaret had become increasingly anxious, checking over her shoulder while walking across campus and asking Jennifer to vary her routine when visiting the Massachusetts State Archives to avoid establishing predictable patterns that someone might exploit. She was scared, Jennifer admitted during her interview on October 18th. Margaret tried to hide it, but I could tell something was really bothering her. She'd always been so confident about her research, never worried about controversy or criticism from other historians. evidence, but these documents she'd found were different. She kept saying that some secrets were dangerous to uncover, especially when they involved families that still had power and influence. The investigation expanded to include interviews with Margaret's colleagues, students, and anyone who might have known about her recent research discoveries. Harvard's history department, normally a collegial environment where professors shared their work and collaborated on research projects, revealed unexpected tensions and rivalries that provided potential motives for someone to want Margaret silenced or discredited. Professor Jonathan Blackwood, a specialist in colonial economic history who had known Margaret since graduate school, admitted that he had been critical of her recent focus on conspiracy theories rather than traditional historical analysis. Margaret was a brilliant scholar, he told Detective Morrison, but she'd become obsessed with this idea that the Salem Witch Trials were orchestrated by a secret cabal of merchants and politicians. She was making accusations without sufficient evidence, potentially damaging the reputations of families based on circumstantial documents that could be interpreted multiple ways. The revelation that Margaret's research had created professional conflicts within Harvard's academic community opened new avenues of investigation, but it also raised questions about whether her disappearance was connected to her controversial historical discoveries or represented an entirely different type of crime. Morrison found herself investigating both academic disputes that might have motivated someone to discredit Margaret's work and the possibility that her research had uncovered modern-day crimes or conspiracies that provided more immediate motives for violence. The first major break in the case came 6 days after Margaret's disappearance, when maintenance workers discovered that a section of Whitmore Library's sub-basement contained tunnels connecting to Harvard's steam distribution system. These underground passages, built in the 1920s to provide heating to multiple campus buildings, had been largely forgotten by current university administration and were not monitored by the library's security system. The tunnels provided a theoretical explanation for how someone could enter or leave Whitmore Library without triggering security sensors, but accessing them required knowledge of their existence and location that few people possessed. University records showed that only maintenance personnel and certain administrative staff had been given information about the tunnel system, and most of these individuals had worked at Harvard for decades without any previous involvement in criminal activity. Detective Morrison organized a systematic exploration of the tunnel system, hoping to find evidence of Margaret's passage or clues about what had happened to her on October 13th. The tunnels themselves were narrow, poorly lit spaces filled with heating pipes and electrical conduits that made movement difficult and dangerous for anyone unfamiliar with their layout. The concrete floors showed decades of dust and debris, but forensic analysis revealed footprints and disturbances that suggested recent activity in areas that should have remained undisturbed for years. More significantly, investigators discovered traces of blood on a heating pipe approximately 200 yards from the access point beneath Whitmore Library. Laboratory analysis would later confirm that the blood belonged to Margaret Whitmore, providing the first concrete evidence that she had been injured and transported through the tunnel system on the night of her disappearance. The blood evidence transformed Margaret's case from a missing person investigation to a potential homicide, fundamentally changing both the resources devoted to solving her disappearance and the legal implications for anyone involved in her fate. Morrison requested additional detectives and forensic specialists from the state police, understanding that the complexity of the case required expertise in areas ranging from historical document analysis to underground engineering systems that few investigators possessed. The psychological profile that Morrison commissioned from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit suggested that Margaret's disappearance had been planned by someone with intimate knowledge of Harvard's physical infrastructure and security systems. The profile described an organized offender who had studied Margaret's routines, understood the library's surveillance capabilities, and possessed the patience to execute a complex abduction that would leave minimal evidence for investigators to discover. More disturbing was the profile's conclusion that Margaret's abductor had likely planned to keep her alive for an extended period, possibly to extract information about her research or to prevent her from publishing discoveries that threatened their interests. The blood evidence suggested that Margaret had been injured during her abduction, but not necessarily killed immediately, raising the possibility that she might still be alive somewhere in the Cambridge area. This possibility energized the investigation and prompted massive search efforts throughout the Boston metropolitan area. but it also created emotional torture for Margaret's family and friends, who found themselves hoping for her survival while fearing the implications of prolonged captivity. Margaret's older brother, David, a successful attorney in Boston, took leave from his law practice to coordinate with investigators and manage media attention that was beginning to focus on Harvard's security failures and the university's response to the disappearance of a prominent faculty member. David's legal background made him effective at navigating the complex jurisdictional issues involved in a case that crossed multiple law enforcement agencies. But his emotional investment in finding his sister also made him increasingly critical of what he perceived as insufficient urgency in the investigation. Margaret wasn't just some random person who wandered off, David told reporters during a press conference on October 25th. She was a Harvard professor who disappeared from one of the most secure buildings in Cambridge while conducting research that apparently threatened someone powerful enough to orchestrate an elaborate abduction. The fact that she's been missing for nearly 2 weeks without any solid leads suggests that we're dealing with people who have resources and influence that extend far beyond what most criminals possess. The media attention that David's statements generated brought both benefits and complications to the investigation. National news coverage of Margaret's disappearance attracted tips from across the country and prompted other historians to come forward with information about similar research into colonial-era conspiracies that had been discouraged or suppressed by academic institutions. But the publicity also attracted attention from conspiracy theorists and amateur investigators who flooded the tip line with speculation and theories that consumed investigative resources without advancing the case. Detective Morrison found herself managing not only the complex criminal investigation, but also the public relations challenges of a case that had captured national attention and raised questions about academic freedom, institutional security, and the power of established families to protect their historical reputations through intimidation or violence. The breakthrough that would eventually solve Margaret's case began with a phone call to the tip line on November 3, 1997, 3 weeks after her disappearance. The caller identified himself as Robert Hutchins, a former Harvard maintenance worker who had been terminated from his job 6 months earlier following accusations of theft and inappropriate behavior toward female students and faculty members. Hutchins claimed that he had information about Margaret's disappearance, but would only speak to investigators in person and in exchange for consideration regarding pending criminal charges related to his termination from Harvard. Detective Morrison initially dismissed Hutchins as another attention seeker trying to exploit the case for personal benefit, but his specific knowledge of the tunnel system and his access to areas of campus that were restricted to authorized personnel made him potentially valuable as either a witness or a suspect. The interview with Robert Hutchins took place at the Massachusetts State Police Barracks on November 5th, with Hutchins accompanied by a public defender who had advised him to cooperate fully with the investigation in hopes of negotiating a plea agreement for his other legal problems. What emerged during 4 hours of questioning was a story that explained both how Margaret had been abducted and why the case had remained unsolved despite intensive investigation. According to Hutchins, he had been recruited by someone he knew only as Mr. Sterling to monitor Margaret's research activities and report on her discoveries related to Salem Witch Trial documents. Sterling had approached him in September, offering $5,000 to provide information about Margaret's work schedule, her research materials, and her plans for publishing her findings. Hutchins, who was facing financial difficulties and legal expenses related to his termination, had agreed to the arrangement without understanding its ultimate purpose. The surveillance had intensified during October as Margaret's research appeared to be approaching publication-ready status. Sterling had instructed Hutchins to photograph documents from Margaret's office and Carol, to monitor her conversations with other faculty members, and to report any signs that she planned to present her findings at academic conferences or to media outlets. On October 13th, Sterling had contacted Hutchins with urgent instructions to prevent Margaret from leaving Whitmore Library with her research materials. Hutchins claimed that he had intended only to steal Margaret's documents and computer files, using his knowledge of the tunnel system to access the library without triggering security alarms. But Margaret had discovered him in her Carol around 2 a.m., leading to a confrontation during which she had struck her head against a metal shelving unit while trying to escape. Hutchins insisted that her injury had been accidental, but he had panicked when she lost consciousness and had contacted Sterling for instructions. Sterling had arrived at the library within an hour, accessing the building through the same tunnel system that Hutchins had used. Together, they had moved Margaret's unconscious body through the tunnels to a vehicle parked near the steam plant, along with all of her research materials and computer equipment. Hutchins claimed that Margaret was still alive when Sterling took custody of her, but he had no knowledge of what happened after they loaded her into the vehicle. The story that Hutchins told investigators was both plausible and horrifying, explaining the physical evidence while suggesting that Margaret had been kidnapped by someone with sufficient resources to orchestrate an elaborate operation and the ruthlessness to potentially murder a Harvard professor to protect historical secrets. But Hutchins's credibility was compromised by his criminal history and his obvious motivation to minimize his own responsibility while implicating someone else in Margaret's fate. Detective Morrison knew that prosecuting anyone based solely on Hutchins's testimony would be nearly impossible, but his account provided investigative leads that might produce independent evidence of the conspiracy he described. The challenge was identifying Mr. Sterling, who had apparently used a false identity and paid for his services in cash that couldn't be traced through normal financial systems. The investigation into Sterling's identity consumed the next 8 months, during which investigators followed leads across New England and into financial records of families whose reputations might have been damaged by Margaret's research. The work required cooperation with federal agencies that had jurisdiction over interstate crimes and access to financial databases that could track large cash withdrawals or unusual transactions during the weeks preceding Margaret's disappearance. The break came in July 1998, when forensic accountants discovered that Jonathan Blackwood, Margaret's colleague who had publicly criticized her research, had withdrawn $25,000 in cash from various bank accounts during September and October 1997. When confronted with this evidence, Blackwood initially claimed that the withdrawals were related to a private family matter that he preferred not to discuss with investigators. Under sustained interrogation, Blackwood eventually admitted that he had been contacted by representatives of several prominent Boston families who were concerned about Margaret's research and its potential impact on their social standing and business interests. These families, whose ancestors had indeed profited from property seized during the Salem Witch Trials, had asked Blackwood to discourage Margaret from publishing her findings or to discredit her research through academic channels. When those efforts failed, the families had escalated their response by hiring private investigators to monitor Margaret's activities and ultimately by contracting with criminal associates to prevent her research from becoming public. Blackwood claimed that he had never intended for Margaret to be harmed and had been told that the plan was simply to steal her research materials and destroy her reputation within academic circles. The revelation that Margaret's own colleague had betrayed her trust and contributed to her abduction devastated the Harvard community and raised questions about academic integrity that extended far beyond her individual case. Blackwood's arrest on charges of conspiracy and accessory to kidnapping sent shockwaves through the university and prompted a comprehensive review of faculty conduct and ethics policies that had failed to prevent such a betrayal. But Blackwood's confession still didn't answer the most important question: what had happened to Margaret Whitmore after she was taken from Whitmore Library on October 13, 1997? The search for Margaret's body began in earnest during the summer of 1998, as investigators followed leads generated by Blackwood's cooperation and Robert Hutchins's increasingly detailed recollections about the night of the abduction. The investigation had evolved from a missing person case to a homicide investigation, with prosecutors confident that they could eventually charge someone with Margaret's murder even without recovering her remains. But Margaret's family refused to accept that she was dead without definitive proof, and they organized private search efforts that continued for years after official law enforcement resources had been redirected to other cases. David Whitmore hired private investigators and forensic specialists who used ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technologies to search dozens of locations where Margaret might have been buried. The searches revealed nothing except the massive scope of New England's landscape and the virtual impossibility of finding a body that had been deliberately concealed by people with resources and planning capability. As years passed without new developments, Margaret's case joined the ranks of famous unsolved disappearances that captured public imagination while devastating the families left behind with permanent uncertainty. Margaret's mother, Eleanor, died in 2005 without ever learning what had happened to her daughter. Her father, Professor Emeritus James Whitmore, continued searching until his death in 2012, leaving behind boxes of files and correspondence with law enforcement agencies that documented nearly 15 years of unsuccessful efforts to find Margaret or her remains. The case experienced renewed attention in 2019 when advances in DNA analysis and forensic genealogy offered new possibilities for analyzing evidence that had been preserved since 1997. Detective Patricia Santos of the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation using technologies that hadn't existed during the original inquiry. The breakthrough came when Santos applied new DNA extraction techniques to blood evidence recovered from the tunnel system beneath Whitmore Library. Enhanced analysis revealed not only Margaret's DNA but also traced genetic material from two other individuals who had been present during her abduction. One profile matched Robert Hutchins, confirming his presence at the scene, but the second profile belonged to someone whose identity remained unknown. The unknown DNA profile was entered into national databases and compared against millions of samples from convicted criminals, missing persons, and voluntary submissions from individuals researching their ancestry through commercial genetic services. The process that had solved numerous cold cases across the country finally provided the lead that Margaret's case had needed for over 2 decades. The DNA match identified Thomas Sterling, the real name of the man who had used Mr. Sterling as an alias when recruiting Robert Hutchins. Sterling was a 73-year-old former private investigator from Connecticut who had been arrested in 2018 for fraud charges related to an unrelated case. His DNA had been collected during processing for those charges, creating the database entry that would finally connect him to Margaret's abduction. Detective Santos arrested Thomas Sterling on March 15, 2022, nearly 25 years after Margaret's disappearance. The arrest took place at Sterling's assisted living facility in Hartford, Connecticut, where he had been residing since his release from prison on the fraud charges. Sterling, who was suffering from dementia and other age-related health problems, initially appeared confused by the accusations against him, but gradually began providing information about events that had occurred decades earlier. Sterling's confession, delivered in fragments over several interview sessions, revealed the final details of Margaret's fate. He confirmed that she had been injured during the struggle with Robert Hutchins, but was still alive when he took custody of her from Whitmore Library. Sterling had transported her to an abandoned warehouse in South Boston, where he had attempted to interrogate her about her research and force her to reveal the location of backup copies of her documents. Margaret had refused to cooperate, maintaining that her research was based on legitimate historical documents and that suppressing the truth about the Salem Witch Trials was morally indefensible, regardless of the potential embarrassment to modern families. Sterling claimed that he had not intended to kill her, but Margaret had died from her head injury approximately 36 hours after her abduction, while still being held in the warehouse. Sterling had disposed of Margaret's body by weighted it down and dropping it into Boston Harbor from a boat that he had rented using false identification. He had also destroyed her research materials and computer equipment, eliminating the evidence that had motivated her abduction. The warehouse where she had been held had been demolished in 2003 during urban redevelopment, removing any physical evidence of her captivity. The confession provided closure for Margaret's family and the Harvard community, but it also revealed the extent to which powerful interests had been willing to go to protect historical secrets that had enriched their ancestors centuries earlier. The case demonstrated how academic research could become dangerous when it threatened established narratives that supported modern wealth and social position. Thomas Sterling died in custody on September 8, 2022, 6 months after his arrest and before he could face trial for Margaret's murder. His death meant that many details about the conspiracy that had led to her abduction would never be fully revealed, including the identities of the Boston families who had financed her kidnapping and murder. Robert Hutchins, who had served 12 years in prison for his role in Margaret's abduction, was released in 2010 but died in 2018 from complications related to alcoholism and drug addiction. His death removed another potential source of information about the broader conspiracy that had cost Margaret her life. Jonathan Blackwood served served 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy charges related to Margaret's case. Upon his release in 2006, he moved to California and worked as a high school history teacher under supervision that prohibited him from conducting independent historical research. He died by suicide in 2015, leaving behind a note that expressed remorse for his betrayal of Margaret and his role in covering up historical crimes that he believed deserved exposure. The investigation into Margaret's research continued even after her death was confirmed, as historians and legal scholars worked to reconstruct her findings from fragments that had survived Sterling's efforts to destroy all evidence. What emerged was a compelling case that several prominent New England families had indeed orchestrated false accusations during the Salem Witch Trials to seize property from their victims, using the resulting wealth to establish business enterprises that continued to generate profits for their descendants. The revelation of this historical conspiracy provided vindication for Margaret's research and demonstrated the importance of academic freedom in uncovering uncomfortable truths about the past. Her death had prevented the publication of her complete findings, but enough evidence survived to support the accusations that had cost her life. Harvard University established the Margaret Whitmore Memorial Fund for Historical Research in 2023, providing grants to scholars investigating suppressed or dangerous historical topics that might face opposition from powerful interests. The fund represents recognition that Margaret's commitment to historical truth had cost her life, and that protecting academic freedom requires institutional support for researchers who challenge established narratives. The Whitmore Library installed a memorial plaque in Corral 23, where Margaret had conducted her final research session on October 13, 1997. The plaque reads, "In memory of Dr. Margaret Whitmore, who died seeking truth and defending the principle that historical knowledge belongs to all humanity, not just to those powerful enough to suppress it." Detective Patricia Santos, who had finally solved Margaret's case after 25 years, reflected on the investigation's lessons during a press conference announcing Sterling's confession. "This case demonstrates that justice sometimes requires decades of persistent investigation, and that advances in forensic science can eventually solve even the most complex mysteries. But it also shows us that some people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect secrets that they believe are worth killing for." The Margaret Whitmore case remains one of New England's most disturbing examples of how historical research can become dangerous when it threatens modern interests built on past crimes. Her disappearance from a locked library represented not just a criminal conspiracy, but a fundamental attack on the principle that truth cannot be suppressed forever, no matter how powerful the people who benefit from keeping it hidden. For those who followed Margaret's case from the beginning, her story serves as a reminder that academic research is not always the safe, scholarly pursuit that most people imagine it to be. Sometimes the pursuit of historical truth requires courage that can cost researchers their careers, their safety, and ultimately their lives. If you've been following this investigation, consider subscribing to stay informed about other cases where the pursuit of truth has led to dangerous consequences, and share your thoughts about how we can better protect researchers and journalists who risk everything to uncover stories that powerful people want to keep buried. Margaret Whitmore's legacy lives on in the historical truth she died trying to reveal, and in the recognition that some secrets are too important to remain hidden, regardless of the cost of bringing them to light.